but we'll actually ask you to start at.
Do you want me to move this? Advertised farther in advance? Pardon? Was this advertised farther in advance? Because I just heard about it yesterday.
We've had it listed in a couple places for a while. Okay. This is largely designed for posterity. All right. Well, I'm not going to do an introduction, partly because they wouldn't hear me away from the mic anyway, and partly because you should just take it away.
Okay.
So I'm going to kill this light, and then you can start, okay?
Okay.
You're already squeezing.
Not at all.
Okay. Go ahead.
I want to begin these poems for Ukraine with a few notes that I've written. I regard the illegal and immoral invasion of Iraq by Bush based on lies not much different than the illegal, immoral invasion of Ukraine based on lies by Putin. They are both part and parcel of colonialism. And to me, both leaders are war criminals. Further, I think the idea of freedom is the same for Palestinians as it is for Ukrainians. And about these poems, I began writing these poems about 2 days before the invasion of Ukraine, and have written about 60 poems as the war has continued. I've had many days when I have felt I had written the last poem I could about this terrible, murderous war. But then, as I began to make notes for a new poem, I would find in my notes the idea of Ukraine coming up again. In essence, these are all the same poem. Each of them just another way of trying to see this war from where we are. Early on, I began to simply title some poems in Ukraine. I want to thank Eric and Beckett for inviting me to read these poems. I want to thank Felicia Rice, the printer, artist, activist in Mendocino, for putting them up on her site. And there's a link to those poems for Ukraine in, I guess, with the video, Eric, right? When it goes online. So this first poem was written 2 days before the invasion, when Putin just kept moving tanks and troops back and forth along the Ukrainian border. It's called In Ukraine. Birds have begun to sing to tanks, trying to coax them back into their heartless nests, while at a nearby table, the tyrant salts his eggs with blood. And this was the first poem that I wrote on the day of the invasion. It's called George Floyd in Ukraine. The Ukrainian people are just beginning to understand what it feels like to have the full weight of their oppressor's body on their neck, pressing down. This is called In Solidarity. I want to insert blank spaces into this poem. Here, I will be silent and hold up a blank page. This is in solidarity with the Russian demonstrators who are being arrested for holding up blank signs in public spaces. Here, I will hold up a blank page again. I want my blank poem to protest the war in Ukraine as their blank signs so loudly do. In Ukraine, ordinary people are in the street throwing words at death who rides a Russian tank. These people may die, but not before they keep living in their country that continues to sing as it weeps. In Ukraine, I can't see words in my poems anymore. Only lines of the dead and dying falling down the page. This is called Bucha. I imagine that those people were shot quickly, almost casually, but their bodies were found slowly, taking up a certain amount of space on the map of time that each was carrying in their eyes while trying to find a way out or back through the day. I imagine they were hoping not to be seen, though unarmed, as a threat to those with the guns. In Ukraine, it must have taken a good bit of time to tie the hands of civilians behind their backs before you shot them in the head. It must have been tiring, and you were soon to leave. And that's why you began to simply shoot those older Ukrainians whenever you encountered them in the streets or where their voices could still be heard above the shelling. You had taught yourself to shoot anyone with their hands up, anyone who reminded you of the sickness you had brought to these days. As always, no one really praised your hard work. No one really understood how necessary it was to kill the defenseless who might one day remember you, except Putin. Mariupol. I can only imagine the cacophony of hell, but it must sound something like the Russian shelling of where you are underground in the steel plant. And here I open my words to the hammering sound of roofers working 2 houses away, and the splendid light from the same sun that has left you in darkness. Some mornings, my heart wants to stop listening to my conscious thoughts. Some mornings, my poems struggle to stay silent while I read the reports of the mass graves. Ukrainian days. They keep coming through my radio, often crying and shouting at the same time. Each is carrying a body of sorrow wrapped in a shroud of blood. Your kitchen is so quiet in the early morning, they say. We thought to stop here on our way home. Ukrainian childhood. Knowing the alphabet versus being buried under your classroom. Knowing the best place to go sledding versus being killed on the road. Wrapping your arms around your mother's waist as she cries versus the gunfire and explosions around you. In Ukraine. War first abstracts colors and then isolates them. A child's shoe can be shockingly yellow when gathered up and placed alongside her pale, quiet body. In Ukraine. In her pocket, maybe a piece of string and an interesting looking pebble. Maybe a signed school permission slip to visit the museum. What was in her body now were hundreds of pieces of jagged metal. One of those shards she might have liked for its odd shape, and maybe, without the war, she might have picked it up and put it in her other pocket. Here, pushing the slices of bread down into the toaster, watching the sunlight open the garden, steaming coffee in my red cup. Smoothing the sour cherry jam across the toast, listening hard to the fragments of suffering on the radio. Later, stepping off the curb with my cane, I look up, buying a latte and roll, and then driving to Rainbow Grocery. Coming back up the stairs to our house, looking up again at the shadow clouds. I cannot hear any tanks coming up the street. There are no missiles falling out of the sky to kill us. It's called Peace in Our Time. There was no movement towards peace reported today at the 3,000th meeting of negotiators, as all the Ukrainian participants have so far been bombed, poisoned, or strangled in their chairs. The Russians continue to deny responsibility for their murderous acts of aggression, and now wait impatiently in the rubble for the next generation of Ukrainians, survivors, to send more representatives to the table. These next couple of poems have Putin in them. It's called Morning Routine. Each morning, Putin swims in an ever-expanding ocean of blood and emerges refreshed under the shadow of missiles flying towards Ukraine. Each morning, he rises from his breakfast table with small bits of flesh still lodged between his teeth. Nature as an enemy. In a new campaign, Putin is waging war on field mice who have bitten his ankles to the bone, and despite his bloody carnage, stubbornly refuse to kneel in subservience. And he has issued orders to murder one by one all backyard songbirds who do not spontaneously sing together a praise song for him. Vladimir Putin. If you felt an angel softly stroke your face, if the one who still beats you in your dreams went away, if the only one who loved you was still here, if the clouds came apart and the hidden light filled your empty heart, if God sang the letters of your name so that you could finally feel safe and fall asleep. If you could actually see the blood on your hands, would you stop the killing now and not be so afraid of Russia weeping for what you have done? A choir sings to Putin. You can't kill children enough times to impersonate their bodies on the broken sidewalks of their destroyed cities. They will never wave the small Russian flags that you tie to each of their ruined, lifeless hands. In Ukraine, the BBC video shows the cars as twisted metal shot up by a Russian tank on the highway. The camera showing the dead with their faces deliberately blurred on the side of the road, and the dead on the road itself. Bodies later thrown into each other, half burned, alone, side by side, and entangled. The camera, looking for brief solace, shows the trees. At this distance, the trees look close enough to this anguished scene to offer only us imagined comfort. These trees, suddenly close enough for us to hear the mournful wailing of their silence. This is called What Can Be Seen from Far Away. The older woman, with a look of disbelief on her face, as if what she had been through maybe really didn't happen to her, but to someone else. And in the midst of her painful retelling to the camera, to us, she suddenly began to weep, and I felt my own tears fall over what she had endured. And I knew how useless I was. And the 8-year-old on the sidewalk with her mother, telling the camera that she is not afraid, saying that she is the oldest, so she cannot be afraid. And then shells start to fall somewhere in the near distance, and I see her flinch and then gather herself to look at the camera, saying again that she is not afraid. And even as I write this, I am still afraid for her and her family. In Ukraine, you don't have to tell me anything. It's written all over your face. You've lost most of what tied you to your sense of reality. You don't have to tell me what happened. I can see it under the new snow drifting along the rubble, settling upon the bodies in the mass graves. For the poets of Ukraine. Now that we see the morning sunlight move onto one edge of a stand of gathering trees, we know that you are not dead, but falling to your knees, overwhelmed once more by simple, unexpected beauty. An interpreter of streets. We see the war debris of dying in almost every photograph. We imagine ourselves far away, but in truth, some part of our most quiet thinking now sees how close these streets actually are. At Stowe Lake, beauty is the last thing to leave us alone. It's easier for me to spread the newspaper out on the picnic table by the lake and read about the absolute horror and suffering than it is to be there. My words lose meaning for Ukraine. I write from inside a fragment of lost memory, which is perfect for the kind of poetry that I write, but not for knowing anything about the lives of those murdered on a road that I can only inhabit in the silence of a poem. This is the last poem. In Ukraine. All the good days are still inside you and will come back gradually, as do songbirds after any chaotic, upending, deadly storm that never seems to end. Stay safe until then. Thank you.